Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are really immersing ourselves in some quite intense source.
Yeah, it's mostly recent social media commentary, video analysis, that kind of, and it tackles some really volatile topics.
Right, we're talking crime, justice, cultural conflict, and this whole idea of, well, the limits of societal.
Exactly. And these sources, just so you know, they don't pull any punches. They're highly critical of current Western policy, and they specifically target what they call woke empathy, framing it as, well, pretty destructive.
So our mission today is really just to unpack the arguments, the logic, the specific stories these commentators are using.
Right. We want to give you, the listener, a really thorough understanding of what they're actually saying. We're not endorsing it, not refuting it.
No sides.
Just laying out the complex rhetoric that's, really dominating these conversations right now. It's your shortcut to getting up to speed.
Okay, let's get into it. It's definitely a difficult conversation. Where do we start? What's the catalyst here?
Well, the main trigger for this wave of commentary seems to be one specific awful tragedy, the murder of Iryna Zerutka.
Iryna Zerutka. She was the young Ukrainian refugee, right?
That's right, 22 years old. And the sources emphasize this detail constantly.
Why? What's the significance?
It sets up what they see as a core, bitter irony. She literally escaped war, escaped violence in Ukraine.
Only to be killed in the U.S.
Exactly. Murdered on a bus, coming home from her job at a pizza place in Charlotte, North Carolina. The sources frame it as this, profound betrayal of the safety the West is supposed to offer.
And the specifics of her case, that's what really lit the fuse politically.
Instantly, the alleged attacker, Carlos Brown Jr., assaulted her on the bus. But the detail the sources absolutely fixate on is his criminal record.
The 14 prior arrests.
Yes, 14 times, reportedly facing serious violent charges before, including things like robbery with a dangerous weapon.
So for these commentators, this wasn't just random.
Not at all. In their view, it immediately flips from a random tragedy to a completely predictable systemic failure, an institutional failure. And they highlight this chilling detail mentioned in the commentary. The attacker allegedly muttered something like, "I got that white girl."
Okay, so they see a potential racial or cultural motive there.
That's how the sources interpret it, yes.
Right.
And they argue it was a motive allowed to flourish because the justice system kept failing to keep this violent person locked up.
So the initial argument right out of the gate is pretty sharp then.
Very clear. They say, look, law enforcement did their part. They arrested him 14 times.
But someone else dropped the ball.
Exactly. It was political leadership, the judiciary, they argue, that failed by releasing him again and again.
And that idea of policy failure trumping police work, that seems to be the launching point for their bigger argument.
It really sets the stage. The commentary argues that a key problem, maybe the key problem in modern Western civilization, is what they term suicidal empathy.
Suicidal empathy. What do they mean by that exactly?
Well, the sources define it as this cultural tendency, maybe even a compulsion, to prioritize the feelings, the rehabilitation, the perceived rights of criminals.
Or outsiders.
Or outsiders, yes, over the immediate safety and the cultural cohesion of the people already living there.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. And the sources say this conflict, this tension, shows up in a few key areas.
Primarily three, which we'll dive into now. First, the perceived collapse of the criminal justice system. Second, the erosion of cultural cohesion. And third, how empathy itself is used or maybe weaponized in global politics.
Okay, let's tackle that first one. The criminal justice stemming from those 14 arrests.
Right. And the narrative here, according to these commentators, isn't about the police being ineffective.
No, it's focused squarely on the courts.
Entirely on the judicial branch. The sources flat out state the murderer was released repeatedly by, their highly charged term, Black DEI activist woke judge.
Okay, we need to unpack that term, DEI activist woke judge, as the sources use it. What are they implying there?
So when the commentators use that phrase, they're referring to judges whose decisions they are driven by diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
The argument is these judges focus more on, addressing perceived systemic inequalities or the goal of decarceration, getting people out of prison, rather than on the immediate danger someone poses.
So public safety takes a backseat, in their view.
That's the claim, that this focus leads directly to releasing known violent threats back onto the street, like in this case, 14 times.
And the commentators see this pattern not just as incompetence, but as something more to it.
They frame it as intentional negligence. They bring up this exchange, apparently, where former Governor Cooper suggested law enforcement needed to do more.
And their response?
Immediate, intense, something like, law enforcement did their job. 14 arrests. It's time for you to do your job. They see it as a political failure, a refusal to quarantine dangerous individuals.
So it's not just a bureaucratic failure, it's like a cultural endorsement of risk.
That's exactly how they frame it. That this empathy, this focus on the criminal, becomes a kind of suicidal public policy, which leads them directly to comparing this case with another really high profile.
Let me guess.
Bingo. Daniel Penny, the Marine vet on the NYC subway who restrained Jordan Neely, who was allegedly threatening passengers. Neely died as a result.
Right. Penny argued self-defense, defense of others.
Correct. And the sources really emphasize that Penny acted to protect people. But even though he was eventually found innocent, they say he was, quote, dragged through the mud.
By whom?
By the media, by certain political figures. And this comparison is absolutely crucial to their argument about cultural decay.
How so? What's the connection?
They argue it shows a totally backwards incentive system in the culture. You have a career criminal, arrested 14 times, repeatedly released. But the citizen, the guy who actually steps in to stop a threat, to save lives, the supposed hero, he gets prosecuted, his life gets turned upside down.
And the implication for the Iryna Zarutska case?
Pretty stark and frankly chilling. They suggest that if someone like Daniel Penny had been on that bus in Charlotte,
Iryna might still be alive.
She'd likely have been saved, they argue. But the culture, as they see it, actively tries to ruin anyone who intervenes.
Which creates a vacuum.
Exactly. It creates a society where violent people feel they can operate freely because they know two things. The courts might let them go, and bystanders are probably too scared to step in.
And this critique of inaction, it doesn't just stop at the legal system or bystanders, does it? It goes right to the people on the bus with Iryna.
Oh yeah, they spend a lot of time on that. Criticizing the other passengers who allegedly did nothing, didn't help her during the attack, didn't try to stop the guy from just walking off the bus afterwards.
They see that as a symptom of broader decay.
Definitely. Mass inaction as a defining feature of a society that's breaking down. People are either too scared, maybe of legal trouble like Penny faced,
or just too apathetic.
Or too apathetic, maybe too paralyzed by political correct, they suggest. They point to the surveillance video, which they say shows the attacker calmly putting the knife away, taking off his jacket, and just walking off the bus. Nobody stopped.
So, given that perceived failure of both the system and the public, what's the solution the commentators propose?
Well, this is where it gets extremely intense. They use this moment to argue for a very specific, very aggressive interpretation of the Second Amendment. Meaning, if the courts fail you and the public fails you, the only answer left is immediate personal self-defense. They literally say, and this is a direct quote they highlight, get a fucking gun, kill that bastard immediately.
Wow. So immediate armed resistance is presented as the only logical response in that scenario.
That's the argument, that the social contract is so broken, that's the only recourse left.
Okay, that's an extreme conclusion. Now, earlier you mentioned they blame the judges, even suggesting they should face punishment. How do they justify that?
Yeah.
Applying the murderer's punishment to the judge?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point to clarify. They don't lay out a formal legal argument for it. It's presented more as a moral argument based on direct causation.
Meaning the judge knew the risk.
Exact. They argue that by repeatedly releasing someone with 14 prior arrests for violent offenses, the judge knowingly accepted the risk of future violence. Therefore, the sources contend that judge has forfeited their moral and maybe even legal immunity.
They see them as almost licit.
Functionally co-conspirators is the image.
Yeah.
They're saying the judge's actions directly enabled the murder.
Which brings us to the broader debate on incarceration and punishment they discuss.
Right, and they approach it with that same level of intent. The core argument is that the cultural focus on empathy for criminals over the safety of victims is the direct cause of the chaos they see.
They bring up things like abolishing prison.
Yeah, they mention figures they claim support abolishing prisons, like someone they name, Mumani in NYC, and they contrast that sharply with their own solution, an immediate execution for murderers.
And the justification for that?
Pure pragmatism, as they frame. It saves taxpayer money, they argue, and it guarantees 0% recidivism.
Oh.
The person can't kill again if they're executed.
But the most extreme part is holding the judges accountable.
Absolutely. The demand is that judges who release violent offenders, who then go on to kill, should be investigated, put on trial themselves,
and receive the same sentence the murderer gets.
That's exactly what they propose. The sources state it with chilling clarity. If a judge lets a killer go free and that person kills again, their blood is on your hand. Ultimate statement against what they see as soft-on crime policy.
That whole critique of judicial failure seems like a direct lead-in to the next major cultural cohesion and assimilation.
It flows right into it.
Yeah.
Because the next step in their argument is to move beyond just crime policy and talk about the cultures that people bring with them.
This is where they start challenging cultural relativism.
Very forced. They launch into this extensive argument, rejecting the idea, which they attribute mainly to academia, that all cultures are basically the same or equally good. They hate the notion of humans as just interchangeable units or clumps of cells.
So what's their counter-argument?
They insist that cultures are profoundly different, and they explicitly state that some cultures are, quote, inferior or worse than others.
Worse in what sense?
Specifically, in their ability to foster and maintain a peaceful, orderly, high-trust society. They actually claim they were taught in college by liberal professors that all cultures are identical, and now see that as dangerous propaganda.
So how do they support this pretty controversious?
They pivot immediately to real-world comparison, contrasting what they see as the chaos and low trust in the West with societies they label high trust.
And the prime examples are?
Japan and South Korea. They focus heavily on these two.
What kind of examples do they use?
Really vivid one, meant to illustrate a fundamental difference in social fabric. They talk about Japan and South Korea being incredibly safe, incredibly clean, very low crime.
Like the wallet on the table example.
Exactly. Leaving your wallet or even your expensive iPhone on a cafe table to save your seat, walking away, and having zero fear it'll be stolen.
Or walking down dark alleys late at night.
Right, feeling perfectly safe even at 2 a.m. in a dark alley. They present this level of built-in, assumed trust as the gold standard, the benchmark against which other cultures, particularly immigrant cultures entering the West, should be judged.
But they see a threat to even these societies, don't they?
They do. They point out that because of low birth rates, even Japan is turning more towards immigration.
And they see that as a problem.
Immediately. They argue it introduces cultural conflict right away. One commentator mentions being on vacation in Hokkaido, Japan, seeing Middle Easterners, and complaining that they had to, quote, dice roll to actually meet a native Japanese person.
That sounds more like a personal gripe than evidence of conflict. Do they have more specific examples?
They do cite a more concrete, controversial example. Reports of some Japanese nightclubs banning entry to people holding passports from specific countries.
Which countries?
Turkey, Syria, Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, according to the source. The reason cited was alleged bad behavior towards female customers.
And the commentators' take on that?
They argue it's completely justified. If immigrant groups bring behaviors that clash with or undermine the existing high trust standards, the host country has every right to restrict them until the behavior changes.
And this critique extends beyond just safety or interactions in nightclubs.
Oh, yes. It goes into broader social behaviors, even hygiene. They cite a video, apparently from a Canadian woman, describing what she calls predatory behavior and groping experiences in Canadian bars, which she attributes to newcomer groups of people.
And the commentator's reaction to her story?
Zero sympathy. They essentially say, you did this to yourself. They argue she voted for left-leaning parties, supported the empathy policies that allowed this kind of immigration without demanding assimilation, so she owns the concept.
Wow. And then they get into hygiene.
Yes, and this is where it gets quite graphic and, frankly, offensive in the source material. They talk about things like poop on the floor and reference something called the Poop War Festival in India.
To make what?
To argue that fundamental cultural values about public space and cleanliness are demonstrably different and that Western standards shouldn't be compromised.
They link this to an entitled mentality.
Yes. They use an example, supposedly, of an Indian woman discussing littering who allegedly said something like, I pay my taxes, sanitation workers should clean it up.
Implying a lack of personal responsibility?
Exactly. For the commentators, this confirms their view that assimilation isn't happening and that some immigrants feel entitled to maintain their own standards, even if they clash with the host country's norms.
So if that's the problem they diagnose, what's the solution they demand?
It's incredibly blunt. Assimilate or leave, full stop.
No middle.
None offered in these sources. They argue immigration should only be allowed if it clearly benefits the host nation, filling specific labor needs, perhaps. It should never be used, they say, in a way that subverts or dilutes the existing culture.
What does that mean policy-wise?
They advocate for really tough measures. Some call for basically zero immigration, arguing the country needs time to digest the recent influx.
And the assimilation standard is extremely high.
Extremely. They even talk about kicking out long-term residents in a place like Japan, including, quote, white Americans, if they fail to become fluent in Japanese within, say, 5 or 10 years.
So it's not just about obeying laws.
No, it's full cultural adopt. Language, social norms, standards of behavior. Failure to fully assimilate is viewed, in these sources, almost as an act of hostility against the host nation. That intense focus on defending the internal culture leads pretty directly into the next section, right, where they talk about specific ideological threats.
Yeah, and this is where they really zero in on what they call weaponized.
The sources draw a very direct line from what they see as cultural weakness to ideological subversion, and a huge amount of their commentary focuses on radical elements within Islam.
How do they frame that?
As an explicit existential threat. They allege these elements seek to, quote, conquer the world through the ballot or the bullet. And they argue Western society is too paralyzed to fight back.
Paralyzed by what?
By empathy. or more accurately, by the fear of being called racist or bigoted if they criticize or resist.
Do they provide specific examples of this perceived threat manifesting, say, in the U.S.?
They do. They focus heavily on Dearborn, Michigan. One incident they cite involves the Muslim mayor there. Allegedly, he kicked out a Christian minister from a meeting. The minister was opposing naming a street after someone the sources identify as a Hezbollah terrorist.
And the mayor's justification?
He apparently called the minister's opposition Islamophobic. The sources see this as using politically correct language to shut down legitimate dissent and push a foreign-aligned agenda.
They mention other Dearborn examples too, right?
Yeah, the police badge incident. Apparently, there was an attempt to introduce an optional police badge featuring Arabic writing.
What happened?
It caused a big public backlash, according to the sources, and the idea was quickly dropped, or memory hold, as they put it. They see these things, street names, symbols, as incremental steps toward changing the cultural identity of the place.
And they brought in this concern beyond local.
Definitely. They cite a Muslim speaker in the UK, for instance.
What did the speaker say?
According to the quote used in the source material, he stated that if Muslims gain power and authority, they are religiously obliged to implement Sharia law.
Replacing existing laws.
Yes, replacing what the speaker reportedly called man-made law, which he framed as oppression. Sharia, in this view, is seen as superior divine law.
And the sources add another layer to this, don't they? Something about trust.
Yes, and this is highly controversial. They explicitly bring up the concept of taqiyya.
Which is?
They claim it's a principle within Islam that, according to certain interpretations they cite, allows Muslims to lie to non-Muslims, especially if it's seen as protecting the faith or the community.
So they use this to cast doubt on any assurance.
Exactly. They argue that any statement about peaceful coexistence or integration has to be viewed with extreme skepticism because of this alleged principle.
So the overall conclusion from the commentators is...
It's unambiguous. They argue that pushing back against groups or ideologies that, in their view, want you dead for believing different things isn't bigotry.
It's self-preservation.
It's necessary self-preservation.
Right.
And the fear of being called a bigot is the main weapon being used to prevent that self-defense.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but staying with this theme of ideology, how do they see this playing out in global politics? Weaponized empathy.
They argue that the empathy you see expressed globally, especially in Western media and politics, isn't natural or spontaneous.
It's manufactured.
It's fully propagandized and weaponized, is the phrase they use, meaning sympathy is deliberately switched on or off to support specific geopolitical goals.
What's a prime example?
The Palestine-Israel conflict. The commentators argue Hamas deliberately uses its own civilians as propaganda tools.
How?
By refusing to surrender, they claim, Hamas ensures maximum civilian casualty, which then generates images and stories that fuel global outrage against Israel. They also make a point of mentioning the history.
The 30,000 rockets.
Right. The 30,000 missiles were fired from Gaza into Israel before the recent major conflict started. They argue the media framing often ignores this context, focusing only on Israel's response.
But the core of their weaponized empathy argument seems to be about what isn't covered, right? The ignored atrocity.
Precisely. They draw a stark contrast between the massive attention given to certain conflict and the alleged silence surrounding. They list several examples they claim the global propaganda network deliberately ignored. Such as the alleged murder of 100,000 Christians in Nigeria over a decade, 5.5 million killed in the Congo, 650,000 in Syria, 400,000 in Yemen.
They also mention ISIS atrocities.
Yes, the horrific story, which they recount, of Yazidi girls allegedly being burned alive in cages by ISIS for refusing to convert to Islam.
And the point of listing.
To argue that the media's decision on what constitutes a tragedy worth reporting isn't based on the scale of human suffering,
but on political.
Exactly. Does the story fit a narrative critical of the West? Does it align with existing political biases? That, they claim, is the real criteria. They even question historical narratives.
What about Christian populations in the Middle East?
Right, claiming that countries like Egypt, Syria, Libya, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon were once Christian-majority nations. They ask, rhetorically, how these countries all lost hundreds of thousands of Christians over the centuries. They imply this long, violent, ignored history makes current media narratives about specific conflicts seem selective and dishonest.
And this critique of ideological conflict also turns inward, looking at anti-Western sentiment among some immigrant groups.
Yes, that's the final piece here. They express alarm about what they see as imported hostility towards the host country.
What examples do they?
They show a video clip, apparently of a Somali American running for mayor in Minnesota.
And what's concerning about that?
In the clip, she reportedly talks about maintaining a strong link back home to Somalia and says her goal is to unite her community here as well as back home. The sources question this dual loyalty. Why is an American politician prioritizing ties to another country?
They have more direct examples.
Oh, yeah. They feature another clip, this one of a personality who is apparently an immigrant, openly advocating for the American empire to fall.
Advocating revolution.
Promoting revolution, explicitly saying America should be wiped out. Source commentary on this is blunt. He came to America to destroy it.
And the conclusion they draw from these examples?
It's a defensive one. Why should a nation tolerate people who are seemingly here specifically to subvert the culture and actively work towards the nation's collapse?
Which brings us, logically, to perhaps the most sensitive part of this whole discussion. Crime, race, and the media narratives around.
Yeah, this is where the sources delve into statistics and arguments that are often considered taboo.
They directly address crime stats by...
They do. They cite data, which they attribute to the FBI and DOJ, stating that Black Americans, making up about 13% of the U.S. population, commit around 50% of...
That's obviously a very charged statistic. How do the commentators frame bringing it up?
This is crucial. They frame the act of pointing out these statistics not as racist, but as the ultimate form of, quote, compassion.
Compassion. How do they justify that? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, their logic is this. The same data shows that the vast majority of Black murder victims are killed by other Black individuals.
Okay.
Therefore, they argue ignoring or suppressing these crime statistics, which they claim the mainstream media does, actually harms the Black community by preventing an honest discussion about the root causes of the violence within that community.
So talking about it is necessary to save Black lives, in their view.
That's the argument. And they take it a step further. They claim that people who try to shut down this discussion by yelling racist
actually don't care about Black victims.
Quote, they hate Black people and want them to stay in crime-infested, fatherless ghetto. That's the direct accusation made in the source material.
And they identify a primary cause, internal violence.
Yes, they pinpoint the breakdown of the family. They cite statistics attributed to Charlie Kirk from a debate.
What stats?
That in 1964, about 25% of Black youth in the U.S. were raised by a single. Today, that number is nearly 75. They identify this, the absence of fathers, as the number one issue, far more significant than systemic racism in their analysis.
And then the focus shifts back again to the media's this.
Violently back, using the Iryna Zarutska case as the prime exhibit.
What's the accusation against the media regarding her?
They accuse major outlets, Associated Press, New York Times, CNN specifically mentioned, of initially running 0 stories on her murder. Total silence.
Why? What's the alleged motive?
Because, the sources claim, her story didn't fit the preferred narrative. A white victim, a Black perpetrator with a long record released by the system. It contradicts the narrative of systemic racism against minorities being the primary driver of problems.
And when the story did get covered?
Only after independent media and social media forced the issue. And even then, they accused the outlets of politicizing it, attacking the right for highlighting the case, or running PR for the killer by focusing on his background or potential mitigating factor.
And this is where they bring in the George Floyd comparison again.
Yes, a stark, visceral comparison. They describe George Floyd using the source's language as a career criminal who died of an overdose.
Highlighting the difference in coverage.
Massive, nonstop, global coverage for Floyd. Months of protests and riots, partly fueled by that coverage. Compared to the initial silence, then reluctant and allegedly biased coverage for Iryna, the innocent refugee killed by a repeat violent offender.
The disparity itself is the point they're making.
Exactly. They conclude the media's goal isn't objective reporting, but rather inciting specific kinds of conflict and pushing specific political agendas.
They mentioned something about San Francisco refusing to release crime footage.
Yeah, another anecdote they use to bolster this claim of narrative control. They cite reports that San Francisco Public Transit allegedly withheld security footage of crimes happening on their system.
For what reason?
Out of fear, the sources claim that showing the reality of who was committing these crimes would, quote, make people racist. This is presented as absolute proof that facts are being suppressed to protect a political narrative, even at the cost of public safety.
The sources also included some really disturbing reactions to Iryna's murder itself.
Highly disturbing. They featured clips, apparently from social media, showing some users, identified as Black, who were openly celebrating her death.
Celebrating.
Yes. Comments like, deserve, or, chillingly, quote, we're even for George Floyd now. These clips are used by the commentators to illustrate the level of racial animosity they believe is being stoked by the media's selective narratives and silence.
This leads directly into their critique of the Black Lives Matter movement.
A very harsh critique. Some sources flat out label BLM a terrorist organization.
On what grounds?
They make claims about financial impropriety, stealing charity money. They also point to a specific statement they say used to be on the BLM website. A statement that allegedly said BLM wanted to destroy Black families or disrupt the nuclear family structure. They claim this was removed after backlash, but use it to argue the movement's goals are fundamentally harmful to the community it claims to represent.
So How do they see the BLM movement now? Has anything changed its trajectory in their...
Interestingly, they argue that technology has largely ended the Black Lives Matter movement.
Technology.
Specifically, ubiquitous surveillance, security cameras, cell phone, and police body cams.
Because the footage often tells a different story.
That's their argument, that readily available, clear video footage of police incidents often shows that the police actions, while maybe not perfect, were actually justified in the context of the moment. This contradicts, they claim, the narrative that widespread unjustified police brutality is the norm.
Okay, as we head towards wrapping this up, the sources seem to broaden the critique again internationally at policing in Europe.
Yeah, they use examples from Europe to argue that this isn't just an American problem, that this woke policing, as they call it, prioritizing sensitivity over safety, is a systemic issue across the West.
What kind of European example do they cite?
They point to the UK quite a bit, highlighting incidents they portray as absurd examples of political correctness gone mad.
Like what?
Like police arresting someone for, quote, saying they like bacon near a mosque construction site. Or another case where police allegedly arrested a Jewish man.
Arrested him for what?
For being outwardly Jewish in a certain area. The police allegedly justified it by saying his presence might provoke Muslims and cause a breach of the peace.
So protect the potential aggressor's feelings over the citizen's rights.
That's exactly how the commentators frame it. The ultimate example of suicidal empathy, prioritizing the sensitivities of one group over the fundamental rights and safety of another.
They mentioned France and Scotland, too.
Briefly, migrants allegedly running scams openly in Paris, with police seemingly unwilling to intervene. And then a really heartbreaking story they highlight from Scotland.
What was that?
A 12-year-old girl arrested.
A child? For what?
For carrying a knife and a hatchet. She allegedly told police she needed them to protect her sister from a known local assailant. The sources emphasize the horror of a child feeling the need to arm herself like that.
And the irony.
The perceived irony that police were quick to arrest the terrified child, while the alleged assailant, who was apparently later arrested for assault, was initially ignored. And other crimes like the Paris scams seem to go unpunished. It reinforces their narrative of broken priorities.
Okay, that's a lot. A really wide-ranging and intense critique. Let's try to synthesize this for the listener, pull all these threads together.
Right. So if you boil down everything in this source material, the central narrative they're constructing is that the current crisis in the West is this toxic mix. It's part internal weakness, part external pressure.
The internal weakness being?
Primarily what they describe as hyper-feminized, emotion-driven policy. And the sources, it has to be said, explicitly blame women voters quite heavily for this trend. Coupled with that overemphasis on empathy, especially for criminals or cultural outsiders, often at the expense of the existing population's safety and norms.
And this ties into that philosophical clash they mentioned.
Exactly. They frame it as a fundamental battle of worldview. On one side, seeing humans as basically interchangeable clumps of cells, which leads to cultural relativism and open borders.
And on the other side,
seeing humans as individuals made in the image of God, inherently valuable, yes, but also culturally and morally distinct, implying that borders and cultural standards are necessary and good.
Amidst all this critique, do the sources offer any sense of hope or a way forward?
They do find some hope, interestingly, in technology and alternative media. They repeatedly credit platforms like X, specifically mentioning Elon Musk's purchase, and independent journalists or commentators.
For doing what?
For forcing these uncomfortable stories, like Iryna Zarutska's murder, into the public eye when, they allege, the mainstream media tried to ignore or suppress them.
So bypassing the gatekeepers.
That seems to be the idea. For these commentators, the main tool used to silence dissent and control the narrative is fear. The fear of being labeled racist, bigot, Islamophobe, whatever.
And their proposed defense against that?
It's essentially defiance. Just state the facts as you see them, present the arguments, and when the labels come, adopt what they call the so what lol response. Basically, refuse to let the labels intimidate you into silence. Remove their power.
They use the fall of Rome analogy quite a bit.
Repeatedly. To describe what they see happening in the West now. Failing institution, cultural decay, breakdown of law and order, widespread apathy among citizens, like those passengers on the bus not intervening.
Which leads us then to the final provocative thought we want to leave you, the listener, with, drawn directly from this deep dive into the comments.
Considering all these arguments, we've unpacked the claims about judicial failure, cultural subversion through misused empathy, the alleged inability or unwillingness of ordinary people to defend themselves or their neighbors.
The ultimate question the sources seem to pose is this. Are the forces eroding the fabric of Western society primarily external? Are they driven mainly by radical immigrants, foreign ideologies, hustlers?
Or the primary forces internal? Are they rooted in flawed policies made by our own leaders, a decay in our own cultural values, a kind of societal self-sabotage through hyper-empathy, and maybe a collective failure of nerve among citizens themselves.
External threat or internal rot? That's the stark choice, the fundamental question these commentators insist on.